Okay, welcome to week 10. So this week we're going to be talking about demotivation, and I hope you all had a good spring break. So we're getting near the end of the course now, so there's only about 3 more lectures left, and then you have Skype meetings and your final presentations, basically. So we'll go ahead and get started. So talking about demotivation, uh, it's an interesting topic because not really a lot of people who look at motivation talk about it. Okay, so the primary focus in motivation research is basically on what actually motivates the students, so what has a positive influence. And so there's less focus on what actually reduces the motivation. So we see in one of the readings here we saw like Sakui and Kawi, they talk about the idea of like unmotivation. So they kind of made this umbrella term. And so they lumped amotivation and demotivation together under that. Okay, so I think it's careful that we remember that they're not the same thing. So amotivation is basically you come into something not really being motivated in it from the start. You don't really have an interest in it at all. You never really did. Demotivation is where you actually started with motivation and then you actually it went away after a while. Okay, so something had an influence on you that made it so you were less motivated than you previously were. Okay, so they're not the same thing. We need to remember that the two are separate. Okay, when we think about demotivation, so we're focusing specifically on demotivation here, but when we think about demotivation, it's not a result of the distractions of a more attractive option. So if something else comes up and you suddenly become more interested in that than the original task, that's not a sign of demotivation. That just means your motivation has been placed into something else, something new entirely. Gradual loss of interest across a period of time, that once again is not demotivation. So as time goes on, there could be absolutely nothing there that's having an influence, and you will naturally lose interest in a topic over time. And so that without the appropriate guidance there to kind of prop up the motivation again. Okay, so you can't really consider that as demotivation for that reason. Okay, so there's nothing. Losing interest over time doesn't necessarily mean you have something that's affecting you. And then internal triggers. So anything like, let's say like anxiety or something like that. It's not necessarily like something that is, that's not going to be something that actually demotivates you in a way. It's just going to be, it might be something that has like a temporary effect on you. And I think, well, I mean, going on to the next thing. So, what the easiest way to like talk about this the idea of like internal triggers not being demotivation is because they're not external. Okay, so demotivation is something that's completely external. So you have to have some sort of outside force on you that is like affecting you in some way. It's making you lose interest in the topic because of some sort of influence it's having on you. So we saw a lot of these already kind of, so thinking about like teachers that are boring. So if they're monotonous, they don't change up the activities a lot. That's going to be something that demotivates the students. Okay. In one of the articles today, we saw this idea of like exam prep, kind of, so like school as an exam prep location. So that kind of demotivates students as well because it makes it so that everything's focused on the exam and nothing's focused on real life. Okay. Something that's important to remember. So teachers can motivate their students. So things that we do as teachers, we can actually promote motivation among students. However, the absence of demotivators has a more positive effect on motivation. So if we, as a teacher, the best thing we can do is actually make sure we're not actually doing any of these demotivating behaviors. If any of these demotivating behaviors are there, anything that we do in order to motivate the students will not have nearly as much of an effect as just getting rid of that behavior. the demotivating behavior. Okay, so when we talk about demotivation, we often think about this idea that as a teacher, you have to actually watch what you're doing in the classroom, make sure that you're not doing anything that is considered demotivating, and that's going to go a long way. Okay. Yeah, so teachers have to deal with all types of unmotivation. Okay, so amotivation and demotivation, you're going to get students that have both. Okay, so when you get students like that who show no interest in the topic or who are not really putting effort into the task at hand, it's kind of difficult to tell if the student lacks motivation because they never had to begin with, or if they actually had it and then something happened along the way that took it away from them. So as a teacher, you kind of have to figure out, you get to know your students a little bit more and figure out, so where are they coming from, and get an idea of their interests and what previous interests they had, and ask them why they're, for instance, taking a language class. And so that will kind of give you an idea of whether it's something that is based on a previous experience that they had, or if it's just like they just never really wanted to take the class to begin with. Okay, yeah, so I have here like one may be easier to treat than the other. So if we think about it then, so we have amotivation and demotivation. Demotivation might actually be somewhat easier to treat than amotivation. Okay, so if they came to the class having no interest in the topic at all, they never even had an interest in the topic. The idea here is like it's probably gonna be really difficult to actually foster that interest if they never had to begin with. With demotivation, you have a kind of a template to start with. So they had the motivation or the interest to start with, and then something happened along the way. So they had some sort of bad experience that made it so that motivation or that interest kind of waned. Okay, and then you as a teacher can actually do something. You can have your behaviors can actually make it so that it fosters that interest again. Okay, so you can actually kind of reverse the effects of that poor experience, making it a little bit easier to treat demotivation than amotivation. But both are, it's not an easy task either way. So I don't want you to get I don't want you to think that one is definitely easier than the other. It's just that demotivation is slightly easier probably to deal with than amotivation. Okay, so we see a lot of the discussion about what the top-ranking demotivators are. So some of them are like the boring teachers do the monotonous instruction. So we saw in Dornier that one way to promote motivation is to actually change up activities and do different things. So if you fall into like a rut kind of and you do the same thing over and over again, oftentimes students will get demotivated. Okay, heavy focus on rote memorization. So if you're focusing a lot on like grammatical rules and vocabulary, then odds are students are not going to be they're not going to be able to maintain that interest over a long period of time. So you have to figure out a way to go around that. So get rid of that behavior and substitute with something else. A lack of practical applications. So we saw this kind of gets back to the idea of like authenticity. So we talked about authenticity a couple weeks ago. If they can't really see like the use of what they're doing, this also has to do with like expectancy value theory too. So if there's no value to it, so they can't really link what they're learning to their needs, and if they can't really see how it connects to the real world, it's going to make it so they lose interest really fast. Okay, so you as a teacher, it's your responsibility to draw connections between all of that. And then like the last one here, so a disagreeable teacher behavior or personality. So sometimes students and teachers don't always get along. Okay, so it happens. And so, I mean, one teacher might be perfectly fine for a bunch of students, but then there might be a couple students in that same class that just absolutely despise that teacher and their personality. I mean, that's going to be something that has an effect on the learner too. It just happens. So that's something that's not necessarily always within your control, but I mean, you can kind of try and and change yourself a little bit, at least for that learner, so that you're not having a negative effect on their interest. Okay, so these are some of the top ranking demotivators. And these are the things that we really want to make sure that we're not doing in class. So um, as we're teaching, we want to make sure that that our behaviors don't really have these in them. Otherwise, students will probably lose interest pretty fast. Okay. Perceptions of motivation. So teachers and students see their roles differently. Okay, so teachers are more likely to attribute demotivation to factors other than the teacher. Okay, so they won't necessarily think, or it's common that teachers don't actually think that they're the source of the demotivation. Okay, so I think we saw a quote from Sekui and Kawi where they talk about one teacher he thinks it's not really his fault or his responsibility to motivate the students. So they should actually be motivating themselves. And I mean, it goes both ways. So to an extent, students should be motivating themselves, but to an extent, teachers should also be helping to motivate the students. Okay, so both parties need to be meeting halfway there. Okay. And one thing with demotivation is that teachers often don't really realize the effects that their behavior have on the students. Okay, so that's something that is very difficult to show them, and then it's something that is also very difficult if they have been doing something for a long time and they're finding that it's demotivating. It might be really hard to get them to stop that. Okay. And they like and because we talked about like worth, or so the worth theory. Okay, so personal worth. So face saving. So that talks about how people are prone to do face saving behaviors, or to put things or to do things that are, or say things that make it so that it seems like they're not at fault, and so that they're still a valuable person. Okay, so teachers are more likely to do that in this sense. So they don't want to have the blame put on them, otherwise they feel like a failure as a teacher. Okay, so learners see motivation differently. So they see it as a learner-owned state. Okay, so it's up to the learners to actually help with promoting their motivation. Okay, but they view demotivation as a teacher-owned problem. So they view it as demotivation, or those factors that influence whether or not, or that influence demotivation, are like they view those as originating from the teacher. Okay, so learners do take responsibility generally for their motivation, but they know that there are actions that the teachers take that actually make it so that they can easily lose that motivation over time. Okay. Okay. And then so if we think about this, then so there are certain behaviors that we can do to kind of, or that we see that either promote or help to reduce demotivated states. So poor self-regulatory strategies. So we often see this in students. So sleeping in class, dropping out of class, ignoring the teacher. These are going to be poor strategies that they take when so students that face something that's difficult, they have poor self-regulatory strategies, they'll probably end up doing one of these types of things. Okay, so instead of dealing with it, they kind of become more demotivated because they get further behind, or they have a harder time with it. And so we see that. So students, in a sense, it's not just the teachers that have an effect on the demotivation, it's the students too. So if they're not really using the appropriate strategies, it's going to make things worse. Teachers can help prevent demotivation simply by avoiding demotivating behavior. So I've already said that. Is actually one of the things that it's like one of the simpler problems that you'll see in SLA, or the simpler solutions. You'll see, oh, this behavior is causing learners to lose their motivation, so just stop doing it. I mean, it's easier said than done, and a lot of these behaviors have to do with habit. But after you're breaking the habit, it's a pretty easy fix. And then we see that learners can actually remotivate themselves if they use the appropriate strategies. Okay, so they can place blame on external factors. Okay, They should place blame on the appropriate external factors, though. So going back up to the top there, so sleeping in class, dropping out of class, ignoring the teacher, these are things that they can blame these as, and these would be external factors essentially, but they're not going to be very good strategies. So they need to blame external factors that are better. So saying like, so they can actually blame the teacher if they want to. They can blame the textbook. They can do whatever they want. Something that is actually more useful though than actually than their actions. Okay. And they can also promote self-motivation through affirmation, resourcefulness, goal setting, initiative, and engagement. So we already talked about this during the last lecture. Okay, so Dornier talked about how we can maintain motivation. Okay, and so these are the basic steps that he talked about. Okay, so for this week we looked at 2 studies. So we looked at Flute et al., and so that one's actually more focused on the learners, and then the Sakui and Kawi, and that's actually focused more on the teachers. Okay, so we'll start with Flute et al. So they basically investigated, so what demotivating factors have the greatest impact on students, the degree to which past motivating experiences affect current proficiency in the language, and then whether low proficiency learners show less capacity to self-regulate when experiencing demotivation. Okay, so for their study, they looked at 900 EFL learners. They had a demotivational questionnaire, and so this was administered in the first and second class sessions at the very beginning of the semester to prevent any other things getting in there and affecting the results. And then they also collected TOEIC scores and some of the grade school scores as well. Okay, so these are their proficiency measures. And so when they looked at the survey results, they found 9 factors that were found, and they found 9 factors that affected motivation in some way. And they found that for their first question they're asking in terms of, so which factors have the greatest impact on demotivation, they found that actually teaching methods did. So in the situation that they were looking at Japanese or schools in Japan. Okay, so and these schools had a lot of testing that they did, and so because of the testing, the teaching methods tended to focus on grammar translation as a way to prepare students for the test. And so we see that this is one of the behavior that actually, of the 9 factors that they found, this grammar translation factor actually had the most negative impact on motivation. Okay, so in fact, I think it was the only, I think they mentioned that was the only of the external factors that actually had a remarkably negative or a markedly lower score than the others. Okay, indicating that it was had pretty strong influence. So there's that. So it goes to show that like teaching methods go a long way. So if you have to kind of, going back to what Dornier said about maintaining motivation, we have this idea like we need to actually take things from our repertoire and build up our repertoire first of all, and then take things from it that allow us to have a variety of activities, make it so that we can connect what we're teaching to realistic settings and so forth. Okay, so that's all going to help. They also found so learning outcomes were not as influenced by external factors. Okay, they did find that internal factors have a higher predictive power in that sense. So their scores on the TOEIC or the grade school exam, they're not really, external factors don't really have an influence on those. So things like self-confidence or enjoyment seeking or self-denigration or help seeking, those are all going to be things that that have a strong effect on those learning outcomes. Okay, so higher proficiency learners are going to be more self-confident and do things to seek enjoyment more. Okay, so whereas lower proficiency learners will be more likely to participate in self-denigration or like basically blaming themselves more, and then they'll be more likely to seek help from others as well if they're having trouble learning. So these are all factors that are very much effective, kind of effective in nature, that are having an influence on Okay, and we found also so lower proficiency learners are more susceptible to demotivation. So this shows that so if you're teaching a lower level course in the language, it's important that you it's really important that you avoid these demotivating behaviors. If you don't, these learners are more likely to end up being demotivated. They're going to probably end up dropping out. They won't continue their study, and then it's just it becomes kind of a mess in a way. So we see that lower proficiency learners, and so they also looked at whether they're English majors or not. So non-English majors, lower proficiency learners, um, they had an actual lack of ability to self-regulate. Okay, so they were using poor self-regulation strategies because they didn't really know how else to deal with when they didn't know how else to deal with demotivating behavior when they encountered it. Okay, so it's important to remember these things. So very useful as a teacher to read the study and see. So these are the things that they really dislike, and these are what they do, and it kind of gives you an idea of how you can differentiate your instruction from level to level. Okay, and with higher proficiency learners, it's not so much a big deal if they encounter demotivating behaviors because they will go and learn it themselves if they have to. Okay, the other study, so Sakui and Cowie, so they looked at an open-ended survey and they sent it to 100 EFL teachers at universities, and they did a follow-up interview with 3 teachers. We're not going to focus too much on the details of that, but basically what they were looking at was they're examining how EFL teachers felt limited in motivating their learners. Okay, so they wanted to get an idea. So we often see how the learner's view, but we don't often look at the teacher's view all that much. So basically they found some common themes in terms of how the teachers felt. So they found that there's the institutional systems, the students' attitudes and personalities, and the teacher-student relationships. These are all having some sort of an influence on their ability to motivate students. Okay, so in terms of institutional systems, they had compulsory classes. So, and a lot of them were complaining that these classes are compulsory, and so if students come in and they're not really interested in the topic, there's no way you're going to get them to be interested in it. So that's the problem with compulsory classes, is you have such a wide array of interest levels that you will almost certainly come across students that are amotivated. Okay, so they don't really want to learn it. Large class sizes can have an impact, so they don't really get the individual instruction that they need. And then school type, so in Japan there are like cram schools kind of, so are the cram schools doing a good job in terms of their teaching as opposed to the universities and whatnot? And what types of constraints are placed on the teacher by these institutional systems? That's also important. We also have students' attitudes and personalities. So something that's important to remember. So these are internal to students. So you have those that are negative versus no interest. So if a student walks in, they might have a very negative attitude towards the learning environment. They might actually have no interest in learning the language. So in those situations, teachers feel kind of helpless. Okay. And then there's a lack in self-confidence. That's also going to have an effect on teachers' abilities to motivate their students. Although there's more you can do in this sense, you can actually be a little bit more reassuring of them and help them to build the confidence that they need. And then you also have, it's not always possible to adjust materials. Okay, so students may have a negative attitude towards certain materials, but you can't always change it. Okay, so sometimes, this might also be connected to the institutional systems. So the school might actually have a requirement for a certain topic or whatnot. So it's something that you can't always change as a teacher, and that it's difficult to get around. And then they also found, so in the teacher-student relationships, they looked at the teacher's perceived shortcomings. So does the teacher blame themselves, or how do they deal with all this stuff that's going on in the classroom? And then the incompatibility between teachers and students. Okay, so sometimes groups of students just don't mesh well with the teacher. It happens, and it will probably happen to all of you if you teach. It will happen at least once. So sometimes, in those cases, it's up to the teachers to kind of adjust. And so, I mean, the teachers actually talked about this, and they said that it's very difficult when you have this type of situation. Sometimes it's tempting just to go and ask for a new class, but you can't do that. So you have to find some way around it. And so basically all of these interviews, this is a very informal study really. But a lot of the interviews they come across, or the results from these interviews come with some implications. Okay, so the teachers, one of the biggest implications is that teachers can learn to distinguish between internal and external factors. Okay, so they can learn that what is external to them and what they can do, and what is internal to them and what they are able to do with that. Okay, so they can also learn to identify things that are internal to the students and external as well. Okay, something that they need to remember is that external factors are out of the teacher's control. So things like the institutional requirements, and then the students' attitudes and whatnot. These are things that the teachers cannot control, but they can control the internal factors. So the things dealing with themselves, so how they view themselves as a teacher in terms of their competency, how they interact with the students and build a relationship with them, so that there's not literally a mismatch, and things like that. And so the authors give some suggestions here. So they mentioned creating good relationships and rapport with the students. Okay, and I mean, this is pretty easy to do actually. So what you just need to do is you need to show the students that you're interested in what they're interested in, kind of. So you need to allow them to have a voice and actually use their interests to kind of play around with the language and whatnot. Okay. It helps them to link it to their own needs, essentially. You can also establish clear goals. So we've talked about this extensively. So making sure the goals are clear and specific, so that learners know what's expected of them, and then making teaching high in quality. Okay, so basically this is just you as a teacher being a model for the students. Okay, so you need to be enthusiastic and show and model effort in these different tasks, so the students can actually get behind it more. Okay, so if you're interested in it, if you're not interested in it, there's no reason for the students to be interested. And if you show that you are interested in it and you're enthusiastic and excited, they're more likely to fall in line and go along with it. Okay. Yeah, so that brings us to the end of this lecture. Overall, so we're talking about demotivation, and it's just kind of this idea, like, you need to pay attention to the different behaviors that you do that you conduct in the classroom, I guess, and make sure that they're not having a negative effect on the students. And if they are, you need to remove them. Okay. So something that you have to do for this week is you have to watch the last group presentation video. And in that presentation video, they go through more of the negative, a lot more of the negative or the demotivating behaviors that teachers do. Okay, so you can kind of use that article and that presentation as a way to kind of gauge the types of behaviors that you're doing in the classroom. Okay, so watch that group presentation video and then respond to the discussion questions. Also, so for next week, read Dernier and Ushioda, chapter 7. Okay, so note that I had you guys sign up for Skype meetings. I thought it was supposed to be next week, but it's actually the week after. And that's fine. We can still do them next week. But if you feel like you're not going to have the time to meet because of the other assignments, that's fine. You can put it off, and you can sign up. You can sign up for the following week on Monday, Wednesday, or Friday, and that will work fine. Okay. Yeah, so sign up for a Skype meeting if you haven't done so already. Do this by Sunday. If you haven't done this by Sunday, you're going to lose points. Okay, so you're supposed to have this done by last week on the 27th. and most of you have it done, but there are a few people missing. Make sure you go ahead and do that. Yeah, so read the requirements for the Skype meeting, so I'll be posting those as well. Read them carefully. If you have any questions, email me about it, okay? And yeah, so the lesson plan assignment, which is kind of taking over the last 2 reading quizzes, that's going to be due Sunday, okay? So the 5th. So make sure that you turn that in on time. Okay, so that's it for now. If you have any questions, just email me. I'll also have a forum open on the lesson page for this week, so you can post questions there. Otherwise, go ahead and go forth and work on your assignments, and then I'll meet with some of you next week, and we'll have another lecture next week.